This presentation describes stabilization in an integrated world economy. Active policymaking refers to all actions on the part of monetary and fiscal policymakers that are undertaken in response to or in anticipation of some change in the overall economy, for example, monetary and fiscal policy. Conversely, passive policymaking is policymaking that is carried out in response to a rule, not in response to an actual or potential change in overall economic activity. An example is the monetary rule. Two components of the natural rate of unemployment are frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. Frictional unemployment comes about because of the time it takes to search for the best job opportunities. Outside of recessions or depressions, most unemployment is this type of unemployment. Structural unemployment results from things such as government-imposed minimum wage laws, laws restricting entry into occupations, and welfare and unemployment insurance benefits that reduce incentives to work. Also, union activity that sets wages above the equilibrium level and also restricts the mobility of labor. The natural rate of unemployment is just the rate of unemployment that we expect in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, as when all workers and employers have fully adjusted to any changes in the economy. Deviations from this natural rate are called cyclical unemployment. They are observed over the course of a nationwide business fluctuation. The Phillips curve suggests that the greater the unexpected increase in aggregate demand, the greater the amount of inflation that results in the short run, and the lower the unemployment rate. Also, the greater the unexpected decrease in aggregate demand, the greater the deflation that results in the short run, and the higher the unemployment rate. The Phillips curve shows the relationship between unemployment and changes in wages or prices. It was long thought to reflect a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Here we see on our Phillips curve that at point A, with zero inflation rate, we expect the unemployment rate to be at the natural rate of unemployment. However, if we have a movement, say, down below zero interest or inflation rate, such that we have deflation, unemployment rate will increase, and if we have an increase in the inflation rate upwards, then we have a decrease in the unemployment rate. However, we expect this to shift the Phillips curve such that our new rate moves back to the natural rate of unemployment. The rational expectations hypothesis just says that individuals base their forecasts or expectations about the future values of economic variables on all available past and current information. These expectations incorporate individuals' understanding about how the economy operates, including the operation of monetary and fiscal policy. The new classical approach is a modern version of the classical model where wages and prices are flexible. There's pure competition in all markets, and the rational expectations hypothesis is assumed to be working. In this graph, we see the effects of an anticipated or unanticipated increase in the aggregate demand. Again, as usual, the aggregate demand shifts outward, moving us along the short-run aggregate supply curve. However, in the long run, we expect the short-run aggregate supply curve to move back into intersection with the long-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve at point C. The policy irrelevance proposition concludes that policy actions have no real effects in the short run if the policy actions are anticipated, and none in the long run even if the policy actions are unanticipated. The key assumption is that people don't persistently make the same mistakes in forecasting the future. Under the assumption of rational expectations on the part of decision makers in the economy, anticipated monetary policy cannot alter either the rate of unemployment or the level of real GDP. Regardless of the nature of the anticipated policy, the unemployment rate will equal the natural rate, and real GDP will be determined solely by the economy's long-run aggregate supply curve. These lead us to the policy dilemma. The policy irrelevance proposition seems to suggest that only mistakes have real effects, so then policymakers are powerless to push real GDP and unemployment back to long-run levels when entering a recessionary period. The distinction between real and monetary shocks. Many economists argue that real, as opposed to purely monetary, forces might help explain aggregate economic fluctuations. Real business cycles represent another challenge to policy activism. So what impact would an oil shock have on aggregate demand? Can we explain the Great Depression with the real business cycle theory? And what about the apparent wage and price rigidity within the economy? This shows graphically what the effects of a reduction in the supply of resources would look like. We see that initially we're in equilibrium, where long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand are equivalent. When we reduce the supply of resources, our long-run aggregate supply is reduced, and so we move along with new short-run aggregate supply curves, shifting back until we end up in equilibrium again with a higher price level and a lower real GDP per year. Stagflation is a situation characterized by lower real GDP, lower employment, and a higher unemployment rate during the same period that the rate of inflation increases. Market clearing models of the economy may not fully explain business cycles. So some economists still contend that sticky wages and prices remain important. The new Keynesians have tried to refine the theory of aggregate supply. Small menu costs are costs that deter firms from changing prices in response to demand changes. For example, the costs of renegotiating contracts or printing new price lists. New Keynesian inflation dynamics. In New Keynesian theory, the pattern of inflation exhibited by an economy with growing aggregate demand, initial sluggish adjustment of the price level in response to increased aggregate demand, followed by higher inflation later. Here, with sticky prices, and when aggregate demand shifts downward, we have a new real GDP that's lower than originally. Then to adjust, we have price levels shifting downward, such that we move back to the original real GDP per year. However, since prices are sticky, when aggregate demand goes down, we move back, but prices remain the same, so we end up with lower real GDP anyway. One major point of New Keynesian theory is that activist policymaking can promote economic stability. The U.S. experience with the Phillips curve. Attempts to reduce the unemployment rate by inflating the economy would be thwarted by higher inflation expectations. However, activist policymaking would be offset, and the trade-off between unemployment and inflation would disappear. Economists Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps published pioneering studies. The apparent trade-off suggested by the Phillips curve suggests that this cannot be exploited by activist policymakers. However, New Keynesians say that all that matters is whether a relationship between inflation and unemployment is exploitable in the near term. If it is, policymakers can intervene as soon as unemployment and real GDP vary from their long-run levels, thusly dampening cyclical fluctuations and making them short-lived. Inflation is affected by both anticipated future inflation and average inflation-adjusted real per-unit costs that firms incur in production. Empirical evidence indicates that these two factors are associated with higher observed rates of inflation. So are the New Keynesians correct? Not all economists agree. The new classical theory already indicates that when prices are flexible, higher inflation expectations should reduce short-run aggregate supply and contribute to increased inflation. All macroeconomic theories suggest that various factors that push up firms' production costs should have the same effect on short-run aggregate supply and inflation in a flexible price economy. However, most economists do agree that active policymaking is unlikely to exert sizable long-run effects on any nation's economy. Most agree that aggregate supply shocks contribute to business cycles. Some argue that monetary and fiscal policy actions can offset, at least in the short run, and possibly in the long run, the effects that aggregate demand shocks would otherwise have on real GDP and unemployment. In this table we can see what issues we should consider when determining the desirability of active versus passive policy making.